A man who viciously attacked a customer.
Unprovoked assaults.
It's super aggressive, terrifying attack. Oh,
no! Unexpected terror.
No! No! No!
You cannot put your kid in the damn trunk!
Is this a kidnapping?
And incredible bravery.
It was instinctual.
Killing viral crimes.
If he had stayed in there, he would have died.
Caught on camera.
It's another senseless crime.
I couldn't believe it.
I started yelling, help me, help me.
I felt violated.
It's definitely a messed up scenario.
August 1st, 2022, Hollywood, California. After a busy afternoon at his restaurant, Tim Ratcliffe steps out to grab some pizza next door.
I go to have lunch with my girlfriend, and we went outside to sit down at the patio.
But then, something at another table catches his eye.
I couldn't believe that I was actually seeing what I was seeing.
A man comes out of nowhere to sucker punch someone.
He was just knocked violently to the ground.
It's like my worst nightmare. You're chilling, having a nice lunch outside, and somebody tries to assault you or rob you.
The assaulter snatches the man's wallet, then makes a run for it, with Tim right on his heels.
So many people in that situation would be more in shock, like unable to process what they just saw, but he leapt right into action.
I just reacted. It was instinctual. He sucker punches me and my glasses go flying. Then the wallet, the cell phone of the gentleman that was stolen also go flying.
Have Tim's impulsive actions put him in danger?
The worst case scenario is Tim trying to be the hero here, not realizing that he could be dealing with someone who was armed or more dangerous than he expected.
Tim does have one advantage. He's trained in martial arts.
I studied judo for 4 years in Japan. It's great for defense. It definitely comes in handy when you're a vigilante.
As the two men struggle, Tim's girlfriend and another bystander jump in to help.
She just sprung right into action.
My girlfriend, Olga, had to kick him a couple times because he's trying to bite me. Then she was stepping on his legs. As I tackled the guy, a little over $1,000 fell out of my pocket. I'd just gone to the bank to make change for the restaurant.
And Tim's girlfriend, not only was she collecting the stolen items, but she was also getting all Tim's money back.
People walking by and driving by were thinking that this is crazy. He was pleading with me, asking and begging that he won't do this again, and he's so sorry.
Tim and his girlfriend managed to hold the thief down until help arrives.
It lasted at least 10, 12 minutes that we were on the ground. Fire department showed up first. They did crowd control. It's probably one of the busiest intersections in Hollywood.
Police arrest 28-year-old Michael Austin Donna and charge him with felony robbery. He is sentenced to 3 years probation.
Tim saved the day by capturing this man. Sweet justice served.
Tim's heroics quickly go viral with almost 1 million views.
And caught on video the moment a Hollywood restaurant owner took down a man who viciously attacked a customer.
There was news station crews waiting in the parking lot of my restaurant for me. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. This went crazy viral.
Restaurant owner in Hollywood quickly jumped into action.
The 64-year-old victim, Richard Schlesinger, who broke his ribs when he fell to the ground, tells reporters he never saw it coming.
I mean, the guy cold-cocked me. It was out of nowhere. I was there with my dog. I was like, well, what is this?
For Tim, the most upsetting part is that the man responsible for the attack is someone he knows.
Michael is a homeless person. He had been coming around the restaurant for a couple months at that point. We'd give him water, give him food, and 3 or 4 minutes beforehand, I had just gone up to him and asked him, do you need anything? He had told me no, he was just fine. I was so emotional about the situation, and I didn't want to believe that this happened.
One bright spot in all of it is that Tim and the man he defended have now become friends.
Richard came down to have a discussion with me and thank me, and we sat down for a good hour. He told me we became brothers, and I 100% agree that we were destined to become friends.
And Tim has no regrets about putting himself in harm's way.
And I would do it again in a heartbeat. There's no reason for having injustice in public.
But as this next clip reveals, when you deal with the public, you never know who is on the edge of violence.
Do you have anything on you? Anything sharp?
You can never judge a book by its cover.
Stay out of the car. Ma'am, do not get in that car. No!
November 6th, 2021, St. Paul, Minnesota. Just before midnight, a state trooper stops a woman for driving erratically in a construction zone. Something is off.
What are you doing? What are you doing?
Grandma, why are we acting like this?
It's almost midnight, and she's wearing sunglasses. That should have been the first red flag.
What are you doing?
I'm trying to find my way out.
Okay, this is a one-way.
Yeah, but do I go down this lane or that lane?
For a moment, it seems as if the woman is innocently confused.
This is a one-way?
Yeah. Do you have your driver's license on you?
But dispatch warns the trooper, Lieutenant Jill Frankfurth, that the 70-year-old woman could be trouble.
Grandma has a track record, and it's a very concerning one.
All right, can you come over here for a second? Yeah. Do you have anything on you? Anything sharp? Any weapons or anything?
No.
Okay. You can just come over here for me.
Sure.
Do you want to have a seat in my back car?
Well, I don't want to have a seat in your back car.
So this is the deal. I just ran this license plate and something came back, so I got to figure it out. So I'm just going to put you back here until I can figure it out, okay?
Can I shut my...
I will take... We're not going... No, we're not going to go anywhere yet. Let's just stay here, and we're just going to figure out what's going on, and then
Why did they run my license plate?
I ran it when I made a traffic stop, so... Let's just go stay here back here for right now.
Let me
Okay?
get it off.
Nope. I don't want you to go back in the car. Ma'am.
Hanson brazenly defies orders. She is hell-bent on getting back into her car.
No, ma'am.
Why is she trying to get into the car? What is she trying to get to? Is she trying to get back to the car to flee the area?
No, ma'am.
Wait a minute.
You're not allowed to come in here.
Why?
No, stay out of the car. Stay, ma'am. Do not get in that car.
And that's when things turn dangerous.
No! She got a gun!
When 70-year-old Jean Hanson is pulled over in St. Paul, Minnesota for driving erratically,
I don't want you to go back in the car. Ma'am.
she refuses to follow orders.
Do not get in that car.
And then,
No!
Lieutenant Jill Frankfurth
Don't!
sees something alarming.
No! She got a gun!
This is so dangerous. What if she shot the state trooper?
No! Don't!
From that distance, she could have killed her, no doubt about it.
No! She got a gun! Gun! She got a gun!
She gets behind the vehicle to create that boundary between her and the suspect.
Gun!
As the trooper screams, Hanson takes off.
She just pointed a gun at me. Copy that. She pointed a gun at you and took off.
Another officer pulls up to see what all the commotion is about.
She pointed a gun at me. I don't know. They're trying to look on camera. She had a warrant.
Then, they go after Hanson.
She's fleeing felon. This is someone who we think is in possession of a gun. They're a danger to not only the officers that are pursuing her, but anyone else who's on that road.
We don't know where she's going next, who she might hurt next, or what is on her mind.
The getaway car is quickly located. And police find Hanson in the most unlikely hiding place.
She's on the outside of this bridge, hanging off with a bottle of tequila in her hand, and it became apparent that she was under some type of mental duress.
In mere minutes, a simple traffic stop has spiraled into a perilous ordeal.
You want to try to help them, but you have to proceed with caution because you don't know if it's a trap. Could they be trying to get you closer just to hurt you before they take out themselves?
This is kind of a perfect storm of disaster. Grandma's not listening to anybody, so they're calling backup.
You're talking the closing of a highway. You're talking SWAT team. You're talking negotiators, mental health professionals.
It takes 2 hours for negotiators to talk Hanson off the bridge. Police place her under arrest. And in court, the judge takes her past into account.
Jean was on a provisional discharge from a mental health facility.
Just 5 months ago, police were called to her house responding to a crisis. And what was Grandma doing? Wielding a shotgun. That time she was charged with second-degree assault and threats of violence.
For the traffic stop incident, Hanson is charged with making threats of violence, fleeing a police officer, and operating a vehicle under the influence. She's ordered to complete a mental health program, and is given a stay of adjudication, which puts her on probation instead of behind bars. After her arrest, police learn something shocking about the gun.
She got a gun!
The gun is made of foil and duct tape.
She got a gun! Gun!
In the heat of the moment, you don't stop to think that gun is fake.
The wild story quickly makes headlines and goes viral with more than 500,000 views.
A major takeaway from this video is never judge a book by its cover because looks can be deceiving.
This situation could have ended terribly.
No! She got a gun!
In another frightening viral incident, it's a mail carrier who is caught by surprise.
Take a look at this shocking video.
Terrifying attack. You wouldn't expect a crime like this to happen in a neighborhood like this.
May 13th, 2023, Millburn, New Jersey. A mail carrier is on the second day of a new job.
This looks like a very nice neighborhood, very manicured lawns, very nice houses.
Then, out of nowhere, two masked men jump him.
And it's middle of the day, broad daylight. That's probably the most shocking part.
A home security camera records as he screams for help. The men violently knock him right out of his shoes.
It's super aggressive. They tackle him to the ground.
He was actually trying to get the AI in his smartwatch to call 911. I don't think that she understood he was under duress.
When you're trying to alert authorities and your devices are not working, all you can do is fight back. You can kick, you can scratch.
The attackers seem focused on trying to shake something out of his uniform. Then they abruptly flee.
Hey, oh my God!
Are you all right? Lenny Whelan, the neighbor whose porch camera records it all, comes out to help. But there's not much he can do.
This crime happened so fast that police wouldn't even have had time to show up.
The mail carrier escapes with only minor injuries and is left in shock.
As a mail carrier, you're really looking out for dogs that are problematic, maybe homes that are hard to find. You're not thinking that someone's going to attack me.
The thieves get away with a skeleton key that opens mailboxes in a nearby apartment complex.
This could have turned out a lot more serious than it did. This man could have been killed.
In New Jersey, it wasn't a dog, but instead two masked muggers who chased a mail carrier.
The story tops the local news.
Terrifying attack on a postal worker.
And homeowner Lenny tells reporters he thinks it was calculated.
The first attack happened right here, and then they went around, as you saw from the video. They were watching. They knew exactly what he was doing. Unfortunately, this was only his second day on the job.
The post office offers a reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction.
Video shows the suspects run to a getaway car, possibly a silver Mercedes.
3 weeks later, police identify one of the men, 24-year-old Zachary Little. It turns out he already has a criminal conviction for unlawful possession of a weapon. For the attack on the mail carrier, he's hit with charges of second-degree robbery and conspiracy to commit robbery. As the video goes viral, people question just how smart our smart devices really are. When the world needed Siri the most, she vanished. Listens in the most unneeded places, but fails to identify an emergency.
It's really weird. We get these smart watches because we want it to track our heart rate, make sure we're getting our steps in. But if you notice there's an elevated heart rate, and I'm clearly in a 360 position because I've gotten tossed around and assaulted, you would think, oh, something seems off. Maybe I should, send police.
But mostly, there's sympathy for a guy who was just trying to do his job.
I feel so bad for mail carriers. They're out in all of the elements. They're just trying to get people packages. And to find that someone wants to assault them, it's pretty heartbreaking.
And And coming up, a disturbing scene so shocking, you'll need to see the video to believe it's true.
Dude, you cannot put your kid in the damn trunk.
We do want to warn you, the video is hard to watch.
Take the kid out the trunk.
I was just so upset.
Dude, you cannot put your kid in the damn trunk. Okay, let's no.
Something is really, really wrong.
No, dude.
August 4th, 2021, Pueblo, Colorado. It's a sweltering day, and Sarah Lucero, a busy mother of 5, is working at her beauty salon.
I had been here for a couple hours and I just went outside to take a little break. I was on the phone and I heard somebody screaming.
It sounds like a woman in the middle of an argument, so initially, Sarah brushes it off.
I thought like she was fighting with her boyfriend, to be honest.
Then, she sees what's really causing the commotion. The woman is inside a car, trying to punch someone.
I seen a little tiny hand come up and try to block it, and oh my God, it's a child that she's hitting. That's when I kind of lost it.
Sarah records on her phone as the woman gets out and tries to shove the young boy into the trunk.
He was just screaming, and she kind of like forced him in there with her hands.
Dude, you can't put that kid in the trunk. Dude, you cannot put your kid in the damn trunk.
Why is the woman doing this?
When it becomes clear that someone is placing a child into a trunk, my initial thought is this a kidnapping?
This is no stranger.
You ain't put a kid in no trunk. You don't know my child.
It's the child's own mother.
When you realize that this is the child's mother, that takes on a different level of scariness. You don't know what risk you're putting yourself in by getting involved.
Bitch, you cannot have that kid in the trunk.
It was 100 and something degrees. I knew if he had stayed in there, he would have died.
The car has no plates. If this mom takes off, the boy could vanish without a trace. As he wails, Sarah screams with even more urgency.
Take the kid out the trunk.
Finally, the woman relents.
Dude, I was gonna take it. Dude, check this out.
No, dude. I swear to God.
When she pulled him out of the trunk and he just looked like, what is going on? Why are you doing this to me? You could see the fear in his face. You could just feel his anxiety. Every part of him was shaking.
I don't give a what the you ain't getting no kid in no trunk.
If this is what's happening in broad daylight in public, what is happening to this child behind closed doors?
You ain't putting that kid in there, I promise you, bitch.
Hey, check this out. He's a small.
I don't give a I will tase you in your face.
I wasn't worried about me. I was worried about the child.
You need to back up now.
Okay, listen.
I don't give a you ain't putting a kid on no trunk.
You know what? Let him go with you for a week.
Let's see.
Sarah's rant has drawn other witnesses to the scene.
I have 5 kids, babe. I have 5. I have 5 kids, and I would never put a kid in no damn trunk. I don't care. It's a baby.
They call 911 and urge her to back off.
Everybody kept just telling me to let them leave, and I'm like, she just put her child in the trunk. If she leaves and this baby dies, we're all at fault.
And this isn't over yet. A man who's been sitting silently in the car the whole time gets out with a gun.
Trunk.
Sarah is terrified of what will happen next.
When that man comes into view, now you have 2 people who clearly are perfectly comfortable abusing a child in this way, who are trying to defend themselves.
After a few minutes of tense arguing, he backs off. But to Sarah's horror, the car speeds away before police arrive.
Well, police searching for a woman who reportedly put her 5-year-old child in the trunk of a vehicle. We do want to warn you, the video is hard to watch.
The disturbing video goes viral, and luckily, a woman who knows the mother turns her in. 33-year-old Chelsea Trujillo is quickly arrested and charged with violating bail and criminal trespass. She is sentenced to 3 years behind bars. Her 5-year-old son is taken into protective custody.
I was definitely overwhelmed with the news crews and people just showing up here at my salon, trying to send me gifts and money, and I don't feel like I deserve it. I feel like anybody should have done the same thing.
God bless this bystander, because in most cases, I do not advise people to get involved. Call the police. That's what they're there for. But in this case, when we're talking about a child that is actively being abused and is in imminent danger, this woman did the exact right thing.
I don't give a. I will tase you in your face.
In the spring of 1988, a quiet residential street in Kansas City, Missouri, became the center of one of the largest homicide investigations in the city's history. The catalyst was not an anonymous tip or a routine police inquiry, but the desperate escape of a young man who reached a neighbor's home seeking help. His account prompted officers to obtain a search warrant for a house at 4315 Charlotte Street. What investigators expected to be a kidnapping investigation quickly expanded into something far more disturbing. Inside the residence, they discovered journals, hundreds of Polaroid photographs, human remains, chemicals, restraint devices, and other pieces of evidence that documented years of violent crimes. The material found inside did not merely suggest that murders had occurred. It revealed a pattern of carefully organized offenses that had remained hidden for years. At the center of the investigation was Robert Andrew Berdella, Jr., a local antique dealer whose public image differed sharply from the evidence uncovered inside his home. Over the following months, detectives conducted more than 500 witness interviews while forensic specialists examined every room, every notebook, and every photograph. Their work would ultimately identify 6 young men who had disappeared between 1984 and 1987 and establish one of the most unsettling serial murder cases in American criminal history. Yet the story of Robert Berdella is not simply about the man who committed these crimes. It is also about vulnerable young people whose disappearances initially attracted little attention, about investigators confronted with an unprecedented volume of documentary evidence, and about the importance of a single survivor whose escape brought years of hidden violence to an end. Robert Andrew Berdella, Jr. was born on January 31, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. He grew up as the older of 2 brothers in a household remembered for its strict discipline. According to accounts from those who knew the family, Berdella's father expected obedience and maintained high standards for his children. The relationship was not described as especially warm, and Robert spent much of his youth attempting to meet demanding expectations. As a child, he wore thick glasses, making him an easy target for bullying by classmates. Although such experiences are not uncommon and do not explain later criminal behavior, they formed part of the background later examined by those trying to understand his life. Academically, Berdella performed well in school. He showed particular interest in biology, chemistry, and art, subjects that reflected both curiosity and technical ability. Teachers recognized his intelligence, even as classmates increasingly viewed him as socially withdrawn. His interests gradually became more unusual, and while he demonstrated artistic talent, he also developed a reputation for behavior that unsettled those around him. In 1965, when Berdella was still a teenager, his father died from a heart attack. People who knew him later suggested that the loss had a profound emotional impact. It is important, however, to distinguish life events from causation. Countless individuals experience childhood hardship or personal tragedy without committing violent crimes. Investigators, psychologists, and criminologists have consistently cautioned against drawing simple conclusions that link difficult experiences directly to later criminal acts. Berdella's father's death remains part of his biography, but not an explanation for the crimes that would eventually define his name. As a young adult, Berdella enrolled at the Kansas City Art Institute, where he hoped to pursue artistic interests. The move also marked his transition to Kansas City, the city where he would spend much of his adult life. During his time at the Institute, classmates reportedly noticed increasingly unusual behavior. Among the incidents later associated with this period were acts of animal abuse presented by Berdella as artistic expression. Such reports contributed to a growing perception that he was willing to disregard conventional moral boundaries. Eventually, his involvement in drug dealing led to legal trouble, and he was expelled from the institute before completing his studies. The expulsion altered the direction of his life. Instead of pursuing a career in art, Berdella established a business that would become well known within parts of Kansas City's alternative cultural community. The shop was called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, a name that reflected the eclectic nature of its inventory. Customers could browse antiques, masks, sculptures, unusual collectibles, and artifacts gathered from different cultures. The store developed a reputation as an unconventional destination, attracting artists, collectors, and people interested in unusual objects. It also became a place frequented by individuals living on the margins of society, including runaways, homeless youths, people struggling with addiction, and male sex workers. Many customers viewed Berdella as knowledgeable and generous. According to later investigative findings, he sometimes offered food, temporary shelter, or assistance to young men facing difficult circumstances. At the time, these actions often appeared charitable. In retrospect, investigators concluded that they also provided opportunities for him to establish relationships with individuals who were especially vulnerable. One of the recurring themes throughout this case is the vulnerability of the victims. The 6 identified victims were all young men, generally between 18 and 27 years old. Several faced unstable housing, financial hardship, or limited family support. Some had become disconnected from relatives, while others lived lifestyles that made their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate, intensive investigations. During the mid-1980s, missing persons cases involving marginalized individuals often received less attention than similar cases involving children or adults from more stable backgrounds. Families filed reports, searched for answers, and hoped for news. But in many instances, there were few leads to pursue. This reality created conditions that allowed a serial offender to continue operating without immediate detection. The first identified victim was Jerry Howell, who disappeared in July 1984 at the age of 19. His family searched for him for years, uncertain whether he had left voluntarily or become the victim of a crime. Robert Sheldon, only 18 years old, disappeared in 1985 after becoming acquainted with Berdella. Mark Wallace vanished later that same year and was eventually identified through photographs recovered during the investigation. James Ferris, another young man who knew Berdella personally, disappeared in 1987. Todd Stoops sought assistance from Berdella during a difficult period in his life and was never seen. Again, Larry Pearson became the final identified victim, with forensic evidence recovered from Berdella's property contributing significantly to the prosecution. Behind every one of these names was an individual whose disappearance left unanswered questions for parents, siblings, friends, and communities. Long before they became entries in police reports or court records, they had lives, ambitions, relationships, and futures that were never realized. That perspective remains essential when examining this case. It is easy for public attention to focus on the offender because of the shocking nature of the evidence discovered in 1988. Yet the lasting human impact belongs to those whose lives were taken and to the families who spent years searching for answers. By the time police finally entered the house on Charlotte Street, several families had already endured years of uncertainty, never knowing what had happened to their loved ones. The investigation that followed would eventually provide many of those answers, though not always the closure they hoped for, because many remains had been disposed of and never recovered. Some families were left without complete physical evidence or traditional opportunities for burial. As investigators gradually reconstructed the timeline, they recognized that the crimes had continued for years while remaining almost entirely hidden from public view. The ordinary appearance of Berdella's business and neighborhood concealed a far darker reality that no one outside the house fully understood. In the next chapter, the investigation begins to reveal how Berdella selected vulnerable victims, how detectives reconstructed years of disappearances through notebooks and photographs, and how one survivor's escape transformed an isolated kidnapping report into a case that would permanently change the history of criminal investigation in Kansas City. During the years between 1984 and 1987, the city of Kansas City continued its daily routines with little indication that a series of connected crimes was unfolding behind the walls of an ordinary residence on Charlotte Street. The victims disappeared one by one, separated by months rather than days, making it difficult for investigators to recognize a clear pattern. Each missing person came from circumstances that were, in different ways, marked by vulnerability. Some had unstable housing, some had become disconnected from family members, and others lived lives that placed them outside the attention typically given to high-profile missing persons cases during that era. Individually, each disappearance appeared tragic but isolated. Collectively, they represented a pattern that would only become visible years later. Robert Berdella's ability to avoid immediate detection depended not only on secrecy, but also on his method of selecting victims. According to the investigation, he typically met young men through his antique store, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, or through the wider network of people who frequented Kansas City's underground social scene. The shop itself projected an image of eccentricity rather than danger. Shelves filled with antiques, sculptures, masks, and unusual collectibles gave visitors the impression of a businessman fascinated by history, art, and the unusual. Regular customers knew Berdella as someone who enjoyed conversation and possessed extensive knowledge about the objects he sold. For vulnerable young people searching for food, temporary shelter, or simply a place where they felt accepted, the store could appear welcoming rather than threatening. Investigators later concluded that this carefully maintained public image helped Berdella establish trust with individuals who often had few reliable sources of support. Rather than relying on sudden violence in public places, Berdella invited victims into a private environment where outside observation was minimal. According to the evidence collected after his arrest, he would gain a person's confidence before inviting them to his home, often presenting himself as someone willing to help. Once inside the residence, investigators determined that the victims were overpowered and held captive for extended periods. Unlike many serial homicide cases in which crimes occur rapidly, this investigation revealed a pattern involving prolonged captivity and deliberate efforts to exercise complete control over victims. Because the case files contain deeply disturbing material, many official summaries deliberately avoid describing every detail. Even so, investigators consistently emphasize that the crimes involved extended abuse rather than impulsive acts of violence. This distinction became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The evidence demonstrated planning, organization, and repeated behavior carried out over several years. Another factor that complicated the investigation was Berdella's method of disposing of victims after their deaths. According to police findings and later court proceedings, he took extensive steps to prevent complete recovery of human remains. As a result, much of the physical evidence that investigators normally rely upon in homicide cases no longer existed by the time police searched the property in 1988. Forensic teams recovered some human remains, including evidence later used to identify Larry Pearson and Robert Sheldon through dental records. But significant portions of the victims' remains were never located. This absence of complete forensic evidence made the documentary material found inside the house especially important. Unlike many homicide investigations that depend primarily on eyewitness testimony or physical crime scenes, the Berdella case was reconstructed through an extraordinary combination of notebooks, photographs, forensic analysis, and ultimately Berdella's own admissions. The identified victims illustrate how easily vulnerable individuals could disappear without immediate recognition of a broader pattern. Jerry Howell, 19 years old, became the first identified victim. When he disappeared in July 1984, his family searched for answers, filing reports and hoping someone had seen him. There was no public indication that his disappearance was connected to anything larger. Robert Sheldon, only 18 years old, vanished the following year after becoming acquainted with Berdella. His disappearance likewise failed to generate evidence pointing investigators toward Charlotte. Street. Mark Wallace disappeared during 1985 and was not identified until after detectives examined photographs recovered from Berdella's home. James Ferris knew Berdella before his disappearance in 1987, a connection that only became significant after the investigation expanded. Todd Stoops sought assistance from Berdella during a difficult period in his life and never returned. Larry Pearson would become the final identified victim, with the strongest combination of documentary and forensic evidence contributing to the prosecution. Looking back, investigators recognized similarities that had not seemed obvious at the time. All 6 victims were young men. Several experienced unstable living situations or financial hardship. Some had limited contact with relatives. Others belonged to communities that historically received less investigative attention when disappearances occurred. None of these characteristics diminished the value of their lives. Yet together they created circumstances in which repeated disappearances failed to trigger immediate recognition of a serial offender. Modern missing person investigations have evolved significantly, partly because of lessons learned from cases such as this one. Today, information sharing between jurisdictions, digital databases, and increased awareness of vulnerable populations have improved investigators' ability to identify patterns that might once have gone unnoticed. During the mid-1980s, however, such resources were far more limited. Each disappearance was largely investigated on its own, reducing opportunities to connect individual cases across several years. As detectives would later explain, one of the most unusual aspects of the Berdella investigation was not simply the number of victims, but the amount of documentation the offender created. Most offenders attempt to eliminate evidence wherever possible. Berdella, by contrast, generated evidence through detailed written records and extensive photography. At the time the crimes were occurring, no one outside the house knew these records existed. The notebooks remained hidden, preserving chronological accounts that investigators would not discover until after Christopher Bryson's escape. Their existence reflected a level of organization rarely encountered in homicide investigations. Police later described the journals as containing dates, times, observations regarding victims, descriptions of events, and plans that corresponded with evidence recovered elsewhere in the residence. Alongside the journals were hundreds of Polaroid photographs documenting different stages of captivity. These photographs proved invaluable during the investigation because they allowed detectives to identify certain victims, compare visual evidence with missing person reports, and establish timelines consistent with other physical findings. Due to their highly sensitive nature and respect for the victims and their families, the vast majority of these photographs have never been publicly released. They remain among the most closely guarded pieces of evidence associated with the case. The significance of these records cannot be overstated. In many homicide investigations, prosecutors must rely heavily on circumstantial evidence to establish exactly what occurred. Here, detectives encountered an offender who had unknowingly preserved a substantial record of his own crimes. Combined with forensic evidence and later guilty pleas, the journals and photographs became central to reconstructing events that otherwise might never have been understood. Yet throughout this period, none of that evidence was visible to the outside world. Neighbors saw an ordinary house. Customers visited an unusual antique shop. Kansas City continued with everyday life while the crimes remained concealed. The breakthrough would come not because investigators independently uncovered the evidence, but because one intended victim managed to survive. On April 2, 1988, Christopher Bryson found an opportunity to escape after Berdella left the residence for work. His decision to flee and seek help transformed years of unanswered disappearances into an active criminal investigation. What began as a desperate attempt by one young man to save his own life would soon expose evidence, linking multiple missing persons cases and force investigators to confront one of the most extensive collections of documentary homicide evidence they had ever encountered. The events of that single morning would alter the course of the investigation, provide long-awaited answers for several families, and reveal crimes that had remained hidden behind the ordinary appearance of a house on Charlotte Street for nearly 4 years. April 2nd, 1988, marked the turning point in the investigation that would ultimately expose years of hidden crimes. Until that morning, Robert Berdella had succeeded in keeping his activities concealed behind the ordinary appearance of his home at 4315 Charlotte Street in Kansas City. The disappearances of several young men remained unresolved, their cases separated by time and circumstance rather than connected through evidence. Families searched for answers, investigators pursued limited leads, and life in the surrounding neighborhood continued without any public indication that the house contained evidence of multiple homicides. Everything changed because one intended victim, Christopher Bryson, found an opportunity to escape. According to the investigation, Bryson had been brought to Berdella's residence and held there until the morning when Berdella left for work. Seizing the brief opportunity, Bryson escaped from the house and ran to a nearby residence seeking help. The neighbor who answered the door was confronted with a young man in obvious distress requesting that police be contacted immediately. That decision, to believe Bryson's account and summon law enforcement without delay, became one of the defining moments in the entire case. When officers arrived, they initially approached the situation as a report involving unlawful confinement and possible assault. At that stage, they had no reason to believe they were standing at the threshold of one of the most significant homicide investigations in Kansas City's history. Bryson's statement, however, provided sufficient grounds for investigators to seek a search warrant for Berdella's residence. Once judicial authorization was obtained, detectives entered the property expecting to search for evidence supporting Bryson's allegations. Instead, they encountered a scene that rapidly transformed their understanding of the case. The search uncovered a collection of evidence unlike anything many investigators had previously encountered. Among the items recovered were numerous handwritten journals documenting events over an extended period, hundreds of Polaroid photographs, human skeletal remains, chemicals, restraint devices, and additional physical evidence associated with the crimes. The discovery immediately suggested that Bryson's experience was not an isolated incident. Detectives quickly realized they were examining evidence accumulated over several years rather than the aftermath of a single offense. Every room required careful documentation. Crime scene technicians photographed, cataloged, and preserved evidence using procedures designed to maintain its integrity for future forensic examination and court proceedings. The sheer quantity of material meant that the search would not be completed in a single day. Specialists from multiple investigative disciplines became involved as authorities recognized the potential scope of what had been uncovered. The journals immediately attracted particular attention. Unlike ordinary notes or personal diaries, investigators found records that appeared systematic and chronological. According to official accounts, the notebooks contained dates, times, observations concerning victims, descriptions of events, and records of physical condition. Detectives understood that these writings could provide a framework for reconstructing crimes that otherwise left little physical evidence because many remains had never been fully recovered. Rather than relying solely on witness testimony or forensic reconstruction, investigators possessed documents apparently created by the offender himself during the commission of the crimes. This was highly unusual and immediately elevated the importance of the notebooks within the investigation. Equally significant were the Polaroid photographs discovered throughout the residence. Police recovered hundreds of images that documented different stages of captivity involving various victims. Investigators approached these photographs with great care, recognizing both their evidentiary value and their deeply sensitive nature. Most have never been released publicly, reflecting the decision to protect the dignity of the victims and spare surviving family members unnecessary trauma. Within the investigation, however, the photographs proved indispensable. Detectives compared them with missing persons reports, existing family photographs, and forensic findings. In several instances, they contributed directly to identifying victims whose disappearances had remained unresolved for years. The images also helped establish chronology by corresponding with details recorded in the journals, allowing investigators to compare written entries with visual evidence recovered from the same location. As forensic specialists continued processing the residence, additional discoveries reinforced the conclusion that multiple homicides had occurred. Human bones and a skull were recovered, along with chemicals and equipment consistent with efforts to conceal evidence after victims had died. Although investigators were able to recover some human remains, they also concluded that much of the physical evidence had been permanently lost because remains had been dispersed over time. This limitation increased the importance of every surviving fragment of evidence, whether forensic, photographic, or documentary. Dental records became particularly valuable in confirming the identities of Robert Sheldon and Larry Pearson, demonstrating how forensic odontology could establish identity even when complete remains were unavailable. News of the discoveries spread rapidly within law enforcement circles, and the investigation expanded at an extraordinary pace. Detectives began reviewing unsolved missing persons cases from previous years, searching for names that might correspond with information found inside the journals. Families who had spent years without answers were contacted as investigators attempted to determine whether long-missing relatives might be connected to the evidence recovered from Charlotte Street. The emotional weight of those conversations cannot be overstated. For many relatives, the possibility that a loved one's disappearance had finally been explained brought a complicated mixture of grief, relief, and renewed heartbreak. While definitive answers are often an important step toward closure, they also confirmed the reality of a loss that some families had continued hoping might someday end differently. As evidence accumulated, the Kansas City Police Department committed substantial resources to the case. Ultimately, investigators conducted more than 500 witness interviews. Former customers of Bob's Bazaar, acquaintances of Burdella, neighbors, family members of missing individuals, forensic specialists, and others with potentially relevant information were interviewed in an effort to reconstruct years of activity. Every statement was evaluated alongside the physical evidence recovered from the residence. Detectives sought not only to establish what had happened to identified victims, but also to determine whether additional victims might exist. Cases involving serial offenders frequently raise concerns that known victims represent only part of the total number of crimes committed. Investigators therefore approach the evidence with caution, recognizing both the importance of proving documented offenses and the possibility that some questions might never receive definitive answers. Throughout this process, one fact remained central. None of the discoveries inside the house would likely have occurred when they did without Christopher Bryson's escape. His survival interrupted a pattern that had continued for several years and provided investigators with the first direct account leading them to the residence. His actions effectively transformed isolated missing person investigations into a single, comprehensive homicide inquiry. It also highlighted the extraordinary role that survivors can play within criminal investigations. In many serial homicide cases, there are no surviving eyewitnesses capable of directing police toward the offender. Here, Bryson's escape provided exactly that opportunity, allowing detectives to intervene before further crimes could occur. As investigators continued examining evidence, attention increasingly turned toward Robert Burdella himself. Initially, he denied the allegations against him. Yet the combination of journals, photographs, forensic findings, recovered human remains, witness testimony, and investigative analysis created an overwhelming body of evidence. Detectives were no longer attempting to prove a single crime, but to reconstruct an entire sequence of offenses extending over several years. The investigation had evolved from an emergency response involving one survivor into one of the largest and most meticulously documented homicide cases ever undertaken by the Kansas City Police Department. The next phase would shift from evidence collection to legal accountability, as prosecutors prepared to confront a defendant whose own records had become some of the strongest evidence against him, while families who had waited years for answers finally began to learn the truth about what had happened to those they had lost. As investigators completed the painstaking search of 4315 Charlotte Street, attention shifted from discovering evidence to understanding its full significance. Every notebook, photograph, forensic sample, and recovered fragment had to be analyzed individually before detectives could assemble a coherent timeline. This was not simply a matter of identifying what had been found inside the residence. The greater challenge lay in determining how each piece of evidence related to years of missing persons cases that had remained unresolved across Kansas City. The investigation demanded patience, precision, and an unwavering commitment to verification. Detectives could not rely on assumptions. Every conclusion had to be supported by documentary evidence, forensic examination, witness testimony, or the defendant's own admissions. The journals recovered from Berdella's home quickly became one of the investigation's most valuable resources. According to official accounts, they contained detailed chronological entries recording dates, times, observations regarding victims, descriptions of events, and notes concerning their physical condition. Unlike personal diaries intended to preserve memories, these records appeared systematic, allowing investigators to compare written entries with missing persons reports and physical evidence. Detectives carefully cross-referenced names, approximate dates, and other identifying details against police databases and family reports. Whenever a possible match emerged, investigators sought independent confirmation through forensic methods or additional documentary evidence rather than relying solely on the notebooks themselves. This methodical approach reflected the standards required in a homicide investigation where every fact would ultimately face legal scrutiny. The Polaroid photographs proved equally important. Hundreds of images had been recovered, each requiring careful examination by investigators and forensic specialists. Because of their deeply sensitive nature, these photographs were handled with exceptional discretion. Their purpose was not public exposure, but evidentiary analysis. Investigators compared facial features, clothing, hairstyles, and other identifiable characteristics with photographs provided by families of missing persons. In some cases, the images became an essential factor in confirming identities that had remained uncertain for years. They also reinforced the chronological sequence established by the journals, providing independent visual documentation that corresponded with written records. Together, the notebooks and photographs formed an unusually comprehensive evidentiary record, one created by the offender himself without anticipating that it would eventually become central to his prosecution. Alongside documentary evidence, forensic science played an indispensable role. Human remains recovered from the property required careful examination to determine identity. Wherever possible, because many remains had been dispersed before investigators entered the house, complete recovery was impossible. Nevertheless, forensic odontologists successfully used dental records to identify Robert Sheldon and Larry Pearson. These identifications provided families with long-awaited answers while strengthening the legal case. By directly connecting recovered remains to known missing individuals, other victims, including Jerry Howell, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, and Todd Stoops, were identified through the combined weight of investigative evidence, including documentary material, witness interviews, and Berdella's own admissions. Each identification represented the conclusion of years of uncertainty for relatives who had searched without knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. As detectives expanded their review of older missing persons cases, They also sought to understand how Berdella had remained undetected for so long. The answer did not lie in a single investigative failure, but in the convergence of several circumstances. The disappearances occurred over a span of approximately 4 years rather than within a compressed period. The victims did not all know one another, and they disappeared at different times under different circumstances. Many belonged to populations that historically faced greater challenges in receiving immediate investigative attention, including young adults experiencing homelessness, financial instability, or limited family contact. In the mid-1980s, information sharing between jurisdictions and investigative units lacked many of the technological advantages available today. Detectives worked diligently with the resources they possessed, but identifying patterns across multiple years remained significantly more difficult than it would become in later decades. Cases like Berdella's would contribute to broader discussions regarding improvements in missing person investigations and the importance of recognizing vulnerability as a factor requiring increased attention rather than reduced priority. While investigators continued assembling evidence, prosecutors began evaluating how best to present the case in court. The quantity of evidence recovered from Charlotte Street was extraordinary, but volume alone does not determine legal strength. Prosecutors had to demonstrate that individual pieces of evidence met standards of admissibility, that forensic procedures had been properly followed, and that every investigative step respected constitutional requirements. Maintaining the chain of custody for journals, photographs, physical evidence, and forensic samples became critically important. Every item recovered from the residence was documented from the moment of collection through laboratory examination and eventual courtroom presentation. Such procedures ensured that the defense could not successfully challenge the integrity of the evidence based on improper handling. Robert Berdella initially denied the allegations against him. Like many defendants facing overwhelming evidence, he did not immediately admit responsibility following his arrest. Investigators nevertheless continued building the case independently rather than relying upon a confession. This approach reflected standard investigative practice. Admissions may strengthen a prosecution, but a successful case should not depend exclusively on a suspect's willingness to cooperate. Detectives therefore continued interviewing witnesses, reviewing forensic findings, and comparing documentary evidence against independent sources. More than 500 witness interviews were ultimately conducted during the investigation. Some witnesses described their interactions with Berdella through his antique store. Others provided information about victims before their disappearances. Family members contributed photographs, dental records, and timelines that helped investigators reconstruct years of missing person cases. Every interview added another piece to a complex investigative puzzle that had remained incomplete for far too long. Eventually, faced with the extensive body of evidence gathered against him, Berdella changed his legal strategy. Rather than proceeding through a lengthy trial in which prosecutors would present the full scope of the documentary and forensic evidence, he entered guilty pleas to multiple homicide charges. In 1988, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder, along with additional offenses. The guilty pleas eliminated the need for families to endure an extended public trial during which deeply disturbing evidence would likely have been presented in detail. While no legal outcome could reverse the losses suffered by the victims' loved ones, the pleas ensured formal accountability without years of additional litigation. Investigators later observed that Berdella displayed little genuine remorse during the legal process. According to official accounts, he described his actions in detached terms and characterized the crimes as the realization of what he called his darkest fantasies. Such statements reinforced investigators' conclusion that the crimes had been deliberate and organized rather than impulsive. At sentencing, the court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that Berdella would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. although some members of the public questioned whether a full trial might have revealed additional information. The guilty pleas nonetheless secured permanent imprisonment while avoiding uncertainty associated with contested proceedings. For the families, however, the legal conclusion represented only one stage in a much longer process of coping with irreversible loss. Court judgments establish accountability, but they cannot restore the years stolen from victims or erase the uncertainty endured before answers finally emerged. The investigation had transformed scattered disappearances into a documented history of serial murder, revealing how one survivor's courage, meticulous police work, forensic science, and careful legal preparation combined to expose crimes that had remained hidden for years. In the final chapter, the story turns to the aftermath of the case. Robert Berdella's final years in prison, the lasting impact the investigation had on Kansas City's approach to missing person cases, and the enduring legacy left not by the offender, but by the 6 young men whose names continue to be remembered. The legal proceedings concluded one chapter of the Robert Berdella case, but they did not bring an immediate end to its impact. By the time the guilty pleas had been entered and the sentence imposed, investigators had spent months reconstructing years of hidden crimes. The evidence recovered from 4315 Charlotte Street had answered many questions, yet it also underscored how much had been permanently lost. Several victims' remains could never be fully recovered because of the methods used to dispose of them, leaving families without the opportunity for the kind of burial or memorial that often provides a measure of closure. For many relatives, the conclusion of the criminal case did not erase years of uncertainty or grief. Instead, it marked the point at which hope gave way to certainty, replacing unanswered questions with difficult truths. Robert Berdella was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to multiple homicide charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder, along with other related offenses. The sentence ensured that he would never again return to the community. Unlike some notorious criminal cases that continue through decades of appeals and repeated courtroom appearances, Berdella's guilty pleas brought the central legal questions to a relatively swift conclusion. Investigators no longer needed to prove his responsibility before a jury because the combination of overwhelming evidence and his admissions had resolved the matter in court. Even so, the case continued to influence law enforcement, forensic professionals, and criminologists long after the sentencing hearing had ended. During his imprisonment at the Missouri State Penitentiary, Berdella remained incarcerated until October 8, 1992, when he died of a heart attack at the age of 43. His death closed the legal story of the offender, but it did not diminish the significance of the investigation or the lessons that emerged from it. Unlike some cases that continue to generate legal uncertainty for decades, the historical record surrounding Berdella became defined not by ongoing litigation, but by the extraordinary quantity of evidence recovered from his residence and the investigative work required to interpret it. For detectives, prosecutors, and forensic specialists, the case demonstrated both the strengths and the limitations of criminal investigation. It showed how careful documentation could expose years of concealed offenses, while also illustrating that some losses could never be completely reversed because crucial physical evidence had already disappeared before police intervention became possible. One of the most significant legacies of the investigation involved the treatment of missing person cases, particularly those involving vulnerable individuals. The 6 identified victims shared characteristics that, in retrospect, revealed an important pattern. They were young men, generally between 18 and 27 years old. Several experienced unstable housing, financial hardship, or limited contact with family. Some belonged to populations that, during the mid-1980s, often received less immediate public attention when they disappeared. The Berdella investigation became a reminder that vulnerability should never be mistaken for invisibility. Every missing person represents a life worthy of equal concern, regardless of social status, housing situation, occupation, or personal circumstances. Although law enforcement practices have evolved substantially since the 1980s, this principle remains central to modern missing person investigations. Increased information sharing between agencies, improved forensic databases, and greater awareness of vulnerable populations all reflect lessons reinforced by cases such as this one. Another enduring lesson came from the documentary Evidence itself. Investigators frequently describe homicide cases in which offenders attempt to eliminate every possible trace of criminal activity. Berdella's case differed because he generated an extensive documentary record through journals and Polaroid photographs. Those materials ultimately became some of the strongest evidence supporting the investigation. The notebooks allowed detectives to compare dates, names, and observations against independent records, while the photographs assisted in identifying victims and establishing chronology. Together with forensic analysis and witness interviews, they created a comprehensive evidentiary framework that was unusually detailed for a serial homicide investigation. The importance of preserving, cataloging, and carefully analyzing documentary evidence has since become a recurring topic in criminal investigative training, demonstrating how written and photographic records can corroborate physical evidence and witness testimony when handled according to proper forensic standards. The investigation also highlighted the indispensable role of multidisciplinary cooperation. Detectives, crime scene technicians, forensic anthropologists, odontologists, prosecutors, laboratory specialists, and patrol officers all contributed to the outcome. No single investigator solved the case alone. Instead, the resolution depended upon coordinated efforts involving careful evidence collection, scientific examination, legal preparation, and hundreds of witness interviews. The more than 500 interviews conducted during the investigation illustrate the patience required in complex homicide cases. Every conversation, whether with a family member, former customer, acquaintance, or neighbor, contributed pieces of information that helped investigators verify timelines and establish factual accuracy. Equally important was the role played by Christopher Bryson. Without his escape on April 2, 1988, investigators may not have entered the Charlotte Street residence when they did. His actions interrupted an ongoing pattern of violence and provided authorities with the information necessary to obtain a search warrant. In many serial homicide investigations, there are no surviving victims capable of identifying the offender or directing police toward the crime scene. Bryson's survival therefore occupies a unique place within this case. His decision to seek help transformed what initially appeared to be a single criminal complaint into an investigation that revealed years of concealed offenses. His courage not only saved his own life, but also prevented the possibility of additional victims. While the historical record often emphasizes the offender because of the shocking nature of the crimes, the significance of Bryson's actions deserves equal recognition as a reminder of how one person's determination can alter the course of an entire investigation. Yet perhaps the most important lesson from the Berdella case concerns perspective. True crime stories can easily become centered on offenders, particularly when their actions appear extraordinary or disturbing. Doing so risks overshadowing the individuals whose lives were taken. The names Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson should not be remembered merely as entries in a criminal case. Each was a son, a relative, a friend, or a member of a community. Each had a future that ended prematurely. Their disappearances left families searching for answers, often for years, before investigators could finally explain what had happened. Although the investigation identified 6 victims, the emotional consequences extended far beyond those 6 individuals, affecting parents, siblings, friends, investigators, and an entire community forced to confront crimes that had remained hidden in plain sight. Cases like this also remind us of the ethical responsibility involved in discussing real crimes. The purpose of examining such investigations should not be to sensationalize violence or elevate offenders to notoriety. Instead, careful historical examination can illuminate weaknesses in investigative systems, demonstrate the value of forensic science, and honor the persistence of those who sought justice despite immense obstacles. The Berdella investigation stands as an example of meticulous police work supported by documentary evidence, forensic analysis, and witness testimony. It also serves as a reminder that every statistic within a homicide investigation represents an individual life, a grieving family, and a community forever changed. More than 3 decades after the investigation concluded, the case continues to be studied because of its evidentiary significance and its impact on criminal investigation. Yet the enduring legacy does not belong to Robert Berdella himself. His life ended in prison in 1992, and his crimes have long since been established in the historical record. The legacy that remains belongs instead to the victims whose identities were restored through painstaking investigative work, to the survivor whose escape ended years of hidden violence, and to the investigators whose careful commitment to evidence transformed scattered disappearances into documented truth. Their combined stories continue to demonstrate that justice is measured not only by convictions and sentences, but also by the determination to uncover facts, preserve dignity, and remember those whose voices can no longer speak for themselves. More than 30 years have passed since the investigation into Robert Berdella reshaped the way many people in Kansas City remembered a quiet neighborhood and an ordinary-looking house on Charlotte Street. Time has changed the city, altered investigative techniques, and introduced technologies that detectives working in the late 1980s could scarcely have imagined. Yet the central questions raised by the case remain remarkably relevant. How can communities better protect those who are most vulnerable? How can investigators recognize patterns hidden among seemingly unrelated disappearances? And how should society remember crimes that are both historically significant and profoundly tragic, without allowing the offender to become the dominant focus of the story? These questions extend far beyond a single criminal investigation. They speak to broader issues of justice, public responsibility, and the value placed on every human life. One of the most enduring aspects of the Berdella investigation is the reminder that vulnerability should never reduce visibility. The 6 identified victims did not disappear because their lives mattered less than anyone else's. They disappeared under circumstances that made immediate investigative connections more difficult to establish. Several experienced unstable living conditions, financial hardship, or limited family contact. Some belonged to communities that historically received less sustained public attention when individuals went missing. Modern criminal justice professionals frequently point to cases like this as evidence that missing person investigations must be guided by evidence rather than assumptions about a person's lifestyle or social circumstances. Every missing person deserves the same careful consideration because every unresolved disappearance carries the possibility that a more serious crime has occurred. This principle has become increasingly important as law enforcement agencies have expanded systems for sharing information across jurisdictions. Although no investigative process can guarantee that every crime will be solved immediately, improved communication and centralized databases have strengthened the ability of investigators to identify similarities that might previously have remained unnoticed. The Berdella case serves as one historical example of why these improvements matter. It demonstrated how multiple disappearances occurring over several years can initially appear unrelated until evidence finally reveals a larger pattern. Another lasting lesson concerns the importance of documentation. In this investigation, handwritten journals and Polaroid photographs became extraordinary forms of evidence because they allowed detectives to reconstruct events that physical evidence alone could not fully explain. Most homicide investigations depend upon witness testimony, forensic science, and circumstantial evidence. Here, investigators also possessed records that established chronology and supported other findings recovered during the search of the residence. The careful preservation and examination of those materials reflected the professionalism required. In complex investigations, Every notebook had to be cataloged. Every photograph required analysis. Every forensic sample demanded scientific examination before prosecutors could confidently present the evidence in court. The case illustrated that successful criminal investigations rarely depend upon a single dramatic discovery. Instead, they result from hundreds of careful decisions made by investigators, forensic specialists, laboratory personnel, prosecutors, and support staff working together over extended periods. It is equally important to recognize the emotional burden carried by those professionals. Detectives assigned to homicide investigations routinely encounter difficult evidence. But cases involving extensive documentary records can present unique challenges. Investigators were required to examine journals, photographs, and forensic findings in order to establish factual accuracy and prepare legal proceedings. Such work demands objectivity while exposing investigators to deeply distressing material. Modern law enforcement agencies increasingly recognize the importance of psychological support for personnel assigned to major crimes. Acknowledging that prolonged exposure to traumatic evidence can affect investigators as well as victims' families. Although the public often sees only the final outcome of a criminal investigation, the process itself involves countless individuals whose work remains largely unseen. For the families of the victims, however, the passage of time follows a different rhythm. Criminal cases eventually close, but grief does not operate according to judicial calendars. Families who spent years searching for answers entered a new chapter after the investigation concluded. One defined not by uncertainty, but by the difficult task of living with confirmed loss. Closure is a word frequently associated with criminal justice. Yet many family members of homicide victims have explained that closure is rarely complete. Answers may replace uncertainty. Accountability may replace unanswered questions. But neither can restore a life that has been taken. Understanding this distinction is essential when discussing real criminal cases. The purpose of historical examination should never be to reduce victims to evidence or case numbers. Behind every investigative milestone stands a family whose experience extends far beyond police reports and court records. Christopher Bryson's role in the investigation deserves continued recognition for similar reasons. His escape on April 2, 1988, altered the course of events not only for himself, but for countless others connected to the case. Had he not reached safety and contacted authorities, investigators might not have discovered the evidence inside the Charlotte Street residence when they did. His survival interrupted an ongoing series of crimes and provided detectives with the opportunity to uncover years of concealed offenses. In many criminal investigations, chance plays a significant role in determining when or whether an offender is identified. In this case, the opportunity created by one survivor became the turning point that changed everything. It stands as a reminder that individual actions can have consequences extending far beyond the immediate moment. Looking back, the house at 4315 Charlotte Street occupies a unique place within the history of American criminal investigation. To neighbors, it had once appeared to be simply another residence. To customers, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar had been an unusual antique store known for its eclectic inventory and unconventional atmosphere. Neither location outwardly revealed the reality that investigators would eventually uncover. This contrast between ordinary appearance and hidden criminal activity has become one of the defining characteristics discussed by criminologists studying the case. It illustrates that serious offenders often conceal their actions behind routines that appear entirely unremarkable to those around them. Recognizing this fact reinforces the importance of evidence-based investigation rather than assumptions drawn from outward appearances alone. The Robert Berdella case also illustrates the value of historical accuracy when discussing true crime. Public interest in notorious cases often encourages speculation, exaggeration, or the repetition of unsupported claims. Responsible documentary storytelling requires a different approach. It demands careful distinction between verified facts, investigative conclusions supported by evidence, and questions that remain unanswered. In Berdella's case, the documented record is already significant without embellishment. The investigation established the identities of 6 victims, documented the methods used to conceal the crimes, recovered extensive documentary evidence, and secured guilty pleas leading to life imprisonment without parole. These verified facts provide more than enough material for understanding the importance of the case, without resorting to sensationalism or unsupported narratives. Ultimately, the historical significance of the investigation lies not in the notoriety of the offender, but in the response that followed his crimes. Investigators devoted months to reconstructing years of hidden violence. Forensic specialists applied scientific methods to identify victims whose families had waited far too long for answers. Prosecutors organized an extraordinary body of evidence into a legally sound case. Families demonstrated resilience despite unimaginable loss. A survivor's determination brought hidden crimes into the light. Together, those elements define the legacy of the investigation far more meaningfully than the actions of the offender alone. As this documentary comes to a close, the most appropriate place to leave the story is not inside the house on Charlotte Street or within the courtroom where the legal proceedings concluded. It is with the names of the 6 young men whose lives were cut short: Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson. Remembering them restores the human perspective that every homicide investigation must preserve. Their stories remind us that justice is measured not simply by arrests, convictions, or prison sentences, but by the determination to seek truth, to value every victim equally, and to ensure that those whose lives were taken are remembered with dignity rather than overshadowed by the individual responsible for their deaths. In the end, that is the lesson that continues to endure long after the investigation itself became history. By the time the Robert Berdella investigation entered public awareness, the case had already revealed a complex intersection of criminal behavior, investigative challenges, forensic science, and human loss. However, beyond the immediate discoveries inside 4315 Charlotte Street, the case also became an important study in how communities, law enforcement agencies, and the justice system respond when crimes remain hidden for years. The investigation did not simply uncover the actions of one offender. It exposed the difficulties involved in recognizing patterns among missing persons cases, especially when victims come from vulnerable circumstances. It demonstrated that solving a complex criminal case often requires not one single breakthrough, but the combination of persistence, evidence, cooperation, and the willingness to continue searching even when answers appear impossible to find. The story of Robert Berdella, therefore, extends beyond the timeline of his crimes and into the broader lessons learned from the investigation that followed. One of the most important aspects of the case was the transformation of individual missing person reports into a connected criminal investigation. Before April 1988, the disappearances of Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson were not immediately understood as part of a single pattern. Each case involved a separate person, separate circumstances, and separate investigative challenges. Without a clear connection between them, authorities had limited information with which to recognize the presence of a serial offender. This situation reflects a recurring challenge in criminal investigations. Patterns often become visible only after a major discovery changes the way earlier events are interpreted. In the Berdella case, that discovery came when Christopher Bryson escaped and directed police attention toward the Charlotte Street residence. Once investigators entered the home and discovered the evidence inside, previous disappearances could be reconsidered through an entirely different perspective. Detectives began examining older reports, comparing details, and searching for connections that had previously been impossible to see. This process required extensive patience because investigators were not simply confirming a known theory. They were building one from the ground up. The more than 500 witness interviews conducted during the investigation represented a massive effort to reconstruct years of activity. Each interview served a specific purpose. Investigators needed to understand Berdella's relationships, his interactions with people connected to his store, his contact with missing individuals, and the timeline of events documented through other evidence. Former customers, acquaintances, neighbors, and families of missing persons all contributed information that helped create a clearer picture. Some interviews provided direct connections. Others helped establish background or eliminate possibilities. In complex cases, even information that appears insignificant at first can become important when combined with other evidence. The investigation also highlighted the critical role of forensic science in providing answers when traditional evidence is limited. Because many remains were never fully recovered, investigators could not rely on a complete collection of physical evidence for every victim. Instead, they used available forensic methods to identify remains whenever possible. Dental records played an important role in confirming the identities of Robert Sheldon and Larry Pearson. These scientific findings provided objective confirmation that supported the broader investigative picture. For families who had waited years without knowing what had happened, identification represented a painful but important moment. It transformed uncertainty into fact and allowed their loved ones' stories to be acknowledged officially. However, forensic evidence also revealed the limits of investigation. Science can identify what remains available, but it cannot recover what has been permanently lost. That reality became one of the most difficult aspects of the case. Another significant element of the investigation was the relationship between evidence and accountability. The journals and photographs recovered from Berdella's residence created an unusual situation, because they provided investigators with documentation directly connected to the crimes. However, evidence must still be processed according to legal standards. Detectives and prosecutors had to ensure that every item was properly collected, preserved, examined, and presented. The credibility of a criminal case depends not only on what evidence exists, but also on whether that evidence can withstand legal examination. The Berdella investigation demonstrated the importance of professional procedures in major criminal cases. The discovery of large quantities of evidence could have overwhelmed investigators if not handled systematically. Instead, teams carefully organized the materials, creating a foundation that prosecutors could use when pursuing charges. The legal conclusion of the case also raised important questions about the balance between public interest and respect for victims. Because the evidence was so extensive and disturbing, there was significant public attention surrounding the investigation. However, responsible reporting required restraint. The details of a crime can sometimes attract more attention than the lives of those affected by it. Investigators, journalists, and historians studying the case have repeatedly emphasized the importance of remembering the victims rather than allowing the offender's actions to dominate the narrative. The 6 identified victims were not simply names connected to a criminal investigation. They were individuals whose lives existed before the crimes that ended them. Their families experienced years of uncertainty before receiving answers. Their stories remain central to understanding the true impact of the case. The investigation also influenced how law enforcement and the public think about vulnerable missing persons. Individuals who experience homelessness, unstable housing, or limited family connections may face additional challenges when they disappear. The Berdella case demonstrated the danger of assuming that certain missing persons cases are less urgent because of personal circumstances. Every disappearance deserves careful attention because every person represents a life of equal value. This lesson continues to influence modern approaches to missing person investigations. Today, agencies place greater emphasis on communication, databases, and recognizing connections between cases that may initially appear unrelated. Although no single case creates all changes in criminal justice, Investigations like Berdella's contribute to broader understanding of why improvements are necessary. The case also remains relevant because of its illustration of how offenders can present different identities to different people. To many customers, Berdella was associated with an unusual antique business. To individuals seeking assistance, he could appear helpful. Yet investigators later uncovered evidence that revealed a completely different reality. This contrast serves as a reminder that appearances alone cannot determine a person's behavior. Criminal investigations must be guided by evidence, not assumptions based on reputation or public image. At the same time, it is important not to overgeneralize from one case. Most people who operate unusual businesses, live unconventional lifestyles, or appear socially isolated are not criminals. The value of studying cases like this lies not in creating suspicion toward ordinary differences, but in understanding the importance of evidence-based investigation. As years passed after Berdella's conviction and death, the case remained a subject of interest among criminologists and investigators because it demonstrated several important themes. The challenges of identifying serial offenders, the importance of listening to survivors, the role of forensic science, and the necessity of preserving victim-centered narratives. Each element contributed to the final outcome. Without Christopher Bryson's escape, the investigation might have taken a different path. Without careful evidence collection, prosecutors might not have been able to establish the full scope of the crimes. Without forensic examination, some victims might never have been identified. Without the persistence of families and investigators, the missing individuals might have remained only unresolved names in old reports. The conclusion of the Robert Berdella case did not provide a simple ending. The legal process ended with a conviction and a sentence, but the emotional consequences continued for everyone affected. Families continued to live with memories of those they lost. Investigators carried the experience of handling one of the most challenging cases of their careers. The community was left with the difficult understanding that serious crimes can exist behind ordinary appearances. Yet from this painful history emerged important lessons about vigilance, compassion, and the responsibility to seek answers for those who cannot seek them themselves. The most enduring message of the case is not about the offender's ability to conceal crimes. It is about the determination of people who work to uncover the truth. It is about a survivor who found a way to escape. It is about investigators who followed evidence wherever it led. It is about families who continued searching for their loved ones. And above all, it is about remembering the victims as human beings whose lives mattered long before their names became part of a criminal investigation. The investigation into Robert Berdella remains one of the most extensively documented serial murder cases in Missouri history, not only because of the number of victims identified, but because of the unusual amount of evidence recovered after his arrest. Many criminal investigations rely on fragments, a witness statement, a forensic discovery, a piece of physical evidence, or a confession obtained after questioning. The Berdella case contained all of these elements, but it was the combination of evidence that made the investigation especially significant. The journals, photographs, forensic findings, and witness interviews created a record that allowed authorities to reconstruct events that otherwise might have remained hidden. However, the significance of the case is not found only in how investigators proved what happened. It is also found in how the investigation revealed the importance of recognizing victims, understanding vulnerability, and examining the circumstances that allow crimes to continue unnoticed. In the years following the conviction, criminologists and law enforcement professionals continued to examine the case because it presented a rare opportunity to study the behavior of a serial offender through his own documentation. The journals recovered from the Charlotte Street residence offered investigators insight into the organization and planning behind the crimes. While many offenders attempt to distance themselves from evidence, Berdella preserved records that ultimately became central to the prosecution. These documents allowed detectives to establish timelines, compare information with missing person reports, and verify details through independent evidence. The existence of such records was unusual, and their discovery changed the direction of the investigation almost immediately. Instead of attempting to reconstruct events solely through interviews and forensic examination, investigators possessed written material that provided additional context. This did not eliminate the need for careful verification, but it gave authorities a foundation from which they could continue their work. The photographs recovered from the residence created a similar investigative advantage. Although the images were never intended for public release and remain protected because of their sensitive nature, they provided investigators with crucial information. They assisted in identifying victims, confirming connections between missing individuals and the residents, and comparing visual evidence with other investigative findings. Their value was not in the images themselves, but in the information they contained. Forensic teams and detectives approached them as evidence requiring careful analysis rather than as material for public curiosity. This distinction reflects an important principle in criminal investigations. Evidence exists to establish truth and accountability, not to provide entertainment. The handling of these photographs also demonstrated the importance of protecting victims' dignity, even during high-profile investigations. As the years passed, the case became a subject of study because of the way multiple forms of evidence interacted. A journal entry alone might not have been sufficient. A photograph alone might not have provided complete identification. A witness statement alone might have raised questions. But when these elements were examined together with forensic findings, they formed a consistent picture that supported the prosecution. This approach remains a fundamental principle of investigative work. Complex cases are rarely solved through one piece of evidence. They are solved by assembling many verified details into a complete and reliable explanation. Another important aspect of the case was the difficulty of identifying the full extent of the crimes. Investigators confirmed 6 victims, but the nature of the evidence and the circumstances surrounding the case raised broader questions. In serial homicide investigations, authorities often consider whether unidentified victims may exist, especially when offenders have operated over extended periods. However, responsible investigation requires distinguishing between confirmed facts and unanswered possibilities. In Berdella's case, 6 victims were officially identified, and those cases formed the basis of the criminal charges and convictions. Beyond those documented victims, investigators could only continue examining evidence without making unsupported conclusions. This careful approach demonstrates the importance of accuracy when discussing historical criminal cases. The case also changed how many people viewed missing person investigations involving adults. Before the Charlotte Street investigation, the disappearances connected to Berdella had not immediately revealed a larger pattern. Each missing person represented a separate investigation with its own circumstances. The victims' backgrounds, relationships, and personal situations varied, but several shared characteristics that made them vulnerable. They were young men, often experiencing unstable conditions, and some had limited connections that might have delayed widespread attention when they disappeared. The tragedy of the case reinforced the idea that vulnerability should increase investigative urgency, rather than decrease it. A person's circumstances should never determine how seriously their disappearance is treated. This lesson has become increasingly important in modern law enforcement practices. Today, investigators have access to improved communication systems, expanded databases, and technological tools that allow them to compare information more effectively. Although these developments cannot guarantee immediate solutions, they increase the possibility of identifying patterns earlier. The history of cases like Berdella's contributes to ongoing efforts to improve investigative procedures and ensure that missing persons receive appropriate attention regardless of background or social circumstances. The role of Christopher Bryson also remains one of the most significant elements of the case. In many investigations involving serial offenders, the absence of survivors makes discovery extremely difficult. Bryson's escape changed that. His decision to seek help provided authorities with the information needed to investigate the Charlotte Street residence. His account gave investigators the legal foundation to obtain a search warrant and begin uncovering evidence that connected multiple crimes. The importance of survivor testimony cannot be overstated. While physical evidence is often essential, the experiences of survivors can provide direction, context, and urgency that no other source can provide. Bryson's actions represented a critical moment when the pattern of crimes was interrupted. The case also demonstrated the importance of cooperation between different areas of criminal justice. Police investigators handled evidence collection and witness interviews. Forensic specialists examined remains and physical materials. Prosecutors organized the evidence into a legal case. Medical professionals assisted with identification. Each group contributed a necessary part of the process. Without cooperation among these disciplines, even a large amount of evidence can become difficult to interpret. The Berdella investigation showed how coordinated efforts can transform overwhelming information into a structured understanding of events. For the public, the case remains a reminder of the difference between awareness and fear. High-profile crimes often create concern because they reveal that serious offenses can occur in familiar places. However, the purpose of studying such cases is not to create unnecessary suspicion toward neighbors, businesses, or unusual individuals. Instead, the value lies in understanding warning signs, supporting vulnerable communities, and recognizing the importance of reporting concerns when evidence suggests wrongdoing. Criminal cases should lead to greater knowledge and prevention, not simply fear. Perhaps the most lasting question raised by the Berdella investigation is how society remembers cases involving extreme violence. Public attention naturally focuses on offenders because their actions are often shocking and unusual. Yet allowing the offender to become the central figure risks repeating a pattern in which victims become secondary. The more meaningful approach is to remember the people whose lives were lost and the families who carried the consequences. Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson were not defined by the circumstances of their deaths. They were individuals with personal histories, relationships, and identities beyond this case. Their names remain important because remembering victims restores humanity to a story that could otherwise become focused only on criminal behavior. Decades after the investigation concluded, the Robert Berdella case continues to be studied because it represents many important aspects of modern criminal investigation. The value of forensic science, the importance of survivor testimony, the challenges of identifying patterns among missing persons cases, and the necessity of treating every victim with equal seriousness. The case demonstrates that justice is often achieved through persistence rather than a single dramatic moment. It required years of unanswered questions, the courage of a survivor, the dedication of investigators, and the cooperation of many professionals working behind the scenes. Ultimately, the historical significance of the investigation does not come from the notoriety of Robert Berdella. It comes from what the case revealed about the responsibilities of communities and justice systems to search for the truth, to protect those who are vulnerable, and to ensure that the people most affected by crime are never forgotten. The story of Robert Berdella is often remembered because of the unusual evidence discovered inside his home, the years over which the crimes occurred, and the way a survivor's escape finally brought investigators to the truth. Yet beyond the facts of the investigation and the legal proceedings, the case also represents a deeper examination of how communities understand danger, how law enforcement searches for answers, and how families endure uncertainty while waiting for information about missing loved ones. The events surrounding 4315 Charlotte Street changed the lives of many people, but the most important legacy of the case remains connected to those who were affected rather than the individual responsible for the crimes. The victims, their families, the survivor who escaped, and the investigators who worked to uncover the truth all became part of a story that continues to be studied decades later. In the years before the discovery of the crimes, Robert Berdella maintained an appearance that did not immediately suggest criminal activity. Through his antique business, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, he interacted with customers, collectors, artists, and individuals who moved through Kansas City's alternative social circles. The store created an environment where unusual interests and unconventional personalities were common, allowing Berdella to exist within a community where eccentricity alone did not appear suspicious. This aspect of the case highlights one of the challenges faced by investigators and communities alike. Serious offenders do not always present themselves in ways that are easily recognizable. A person's public image can sometimes conceal actions occurring away from public view. However, this does not mean that suspicion should be based on personality, appearance, or lifestyle. The lesson from the investigation is not that unusual individuals should be feared, but that criminal behavior must ultimately be identified through evidence and careful investigation. One of the most significant outcomes of the case was the recognition that missing persons investigations require attention regardless of a person's social circumstances. The 6 identified victims were young men whose disappearances initially did not immediately reveal a connection. Some had limited contact with relatives. Some lived unstable lives. Some were part of communities where missing person cases historically received less attention. These factors created challenges, but they did not reduce the importance of finding answers. The investigation demonstrated that every disappearance represents a person whose absence affects families, friends, and communities. Behind every report is a human story, and behind every unanswered question is someone waiting for the truth. The identification of the victims became one of the most important achievements of the investigation. For years, families of Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson lived without knowing what had happened. The recovery of evidence from the Charlotte Street residence allowed investigators to provide explanations that had previously seemed impossible. While those answers were painful, they also ended years of uncertainty. For many families, uncertainty can become its own form of suffering. Not knowing whether a missing person is alive, where they are, or what happened creates a constant state of unanswered questions. The investigation provided facts, but those facts came with the devastating realization that their loved ones would not return. The case therefore represents both the importance of solving crimes and the emotional complexity that follows when the truth is finally discovered. The role of Christopher Bryson remains central to understanding how the investigation unfolded. His escape was the event that exposed the hidden evidence inside the Charlotte Street residence. Without his decision to seek help and provide information to authorities, investigators may not have discovered the scope of the crimes when they did. His actions changed the course of the investigation and prevented the continued concealment of the offenses. Survivors often provide a perspective that cannot be obtained through physical evidence alone. They can describe events, identify locations, and provide investigators with information that leads to further discoveries. In this case, Bryson's experience became the connection between a single criminal complaint and a much larger investigation involving multiple victims. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of evidence preservation and forensic methodology. The journals and photographs recovered from the residence were unlike the evidence typically found in homicide cases. Their existence allowed investigators to reconstruct parts of the timeline with unusual detail. However, the value of these materials depended on the careful work of detectives, crime scene specialists, and prosecutors. Evidence does not explain itself. It must be collected properly, examined objectively, and interpreted within the broader context of the investigation. The Berdella case showed that even overwhelming evidence requires professional handling to ensure that justice can be achieved through legal processes. The prosecution's decision to accept guilty pleas rather than proceed through a lengthy trial also reflected the unique circumstances of the case. The evidence against Berdella was extensive, and the guilty pleas resulted in convictions that permanently removed him from society. For the victims' families, avoiding a prolonged trial may have prevented years of additional public discussion of painful evidence. However, the legal outcome could not fully resolve the emotional impact of the crimes. The justice system can determine responsibility and impose punishment, but it cannot restore lost lives or remove the pain experienced by those left behind. This distinction is important when examining the aftermath of any major criminal case. The death of Robert Berdella in prison on October 8, 1992, ended the life of the offender. But it did not end the significance of the case. His death meant that no further legal proceedings would occur, but the investigation continued to be studied because of the lessons it provided. Researchers examined the case as an example of offender behavior, investigative challenges, and the role of documentation in criminal cases. At the same time, responsible discussion of the case requires avoiding the mistake of giving excessive attention to the offender while minimizing the experiences of victims. The purpose of examining criminal history is to understand, learn, and remember, not to create fascination with those who caused harm. Over time, the Berdella case became part of broader conversations about serial offenders and the warning signs that investigators may encounter. However, experts caution against simplistic explanations. Criminal behavior develops through complex interactions of personal choices and circumstances, and individual cases should not be used to create assumptions about entire groups of people. The importance of the investigation lies not in creating a simple explanation for why crimes occur, but in examining how evidence, awareness, and response can improve future outcomes. The case also serves as a reminder that prevention and justice depend on community involvement. Families reporting missing loved ones, neighbors noticing concerning situations, witnesses sharing information, and survivors coming forward all contribute to the ability of authorities to respond effectively. Law enforcement agencies cannot solve crimes without cooperation from the public. The discovery of the crimes at Charlotte Street was ultimately made possible because a survivor reached out for help and authorities responded. That moment demonstrates the importance of listening when someone reports that something is wrong. As the decades have passed, the Robert Berdella case has remained part of true crime history not because it represents something extraordinary about the offender, but because it reveals important truths about victims, investigations, and justice. It shows the consequences of overlooking vulnerable individuals. It demonstrates the importance of connecting information across time and circumstances. It highlights the value of scientific evidence and careful police work. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every investigation are real people whose lives cannot be reduced to case files. The final measure of any criminal investigation is not only whether an offender is identified or punished, it is also whether the truth is discovered, whether victims are remembered, and whether society learns enough to prevent future suffering. The story of Robert Berdella is ultimately a story of loss, investigation, and remembrance. It is a reminder that even when crimes are hidden for years, persistence can uncover the truth, and that every victim deserves to have their name remembered with dignity. The conclusion of the Robert Berdella case did not arrive with a single moment of discovery or a simple resolution. Instead, it was the result of years of unanswered questions, the determination of investigators, the courage of a survivor, and the painful journey of families searching for the truth. When authorities entered the residence at 4315 Charlotte Street in April 1988, they uncovered evidence that transformed a collection of separate missing person cases into one of the most significant criminal investigations in Kansas City history. The evidence recovered from that house provided answers, but those answers revealed a tragedy far greater than anyone had initially imagined. The investigation demonstrated both the power of modern forensic methods and the limitations of justice when confronting the loss of human life. It showed that evidence can uncover the truth, but it cannot undo the suffering experienced by victims and their families. In the final analysis, the legacy of this case is not defined by the offender. It is defined by the people whose lives were changed forever and by the efforts made to ensure that their stories were not forgotten. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. died in prison on October 8, 1992, after suffering a heart attack at the age of 43. His death ended the physical presence of the man responsible for the crimes, but it did not erase the significance of what investigators discovered or the questions the case raised about society's ability to recognize danger. The criminal proceedings had already established his responsibility through guilty pleas and the overwhelming evidence recovered from his residence. The legal system had reached its conclusion, but the broader examination of the case continued. Researchers, investigators, and historians continued to study the investigation because it represented a rare example of a serial homicide case where the offender had unknowingly preserved extensive evidence of his own actions. Yet even with all the attention surrounding the case, the most important part of the story remains the lives that were lost. Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson were not simply victims listed in investigative documents. They were individuals with families, personal histories, and futures that ended far too soon. The investigation eventually restored their identities and provided answers about what had happened. But those answers came after years of uncertainty and pain. Their families had experienced the difficult reality faced by many relatives of missing persons. The constant search for information, the absence of certainty, and the emotional burden of not knowing. When the truth finally emerged, it brought both resolution and grief. The conclusion of a missing person case does not always bring peace. Sometimes, it confirms the worst fear that families have carried for years. This is one of the most difficult realities of homicide investigations. Justice may provide accountability, but it cannot return the person who was lost. The case also remains significant because of the role played by Christopher Bryson, whose escape changed the entire course of events. His survival created the opportunity for investigators to discover evidence that otherwise might have remained hidden. His decision to seek help demonstrated the importance of survivors in criminal investigations. Without his actions, the crimes might have continued undiscovered for longer, potentially leaving additional victims without answers. Bryson's experience serves as a reminder that survivors are not merely witnesses to crimes. They are individuals whose courage can influence the outcome of an entire investigation. His role represents one of the most important turning points in the case and remains a central part of understanding how the truth was finally revealed. The investigation itself became an example of how law enforcement agencies must approach complex cases. Detectives were faced with an enormous amount of information, handwritten journals, hundreds of photographs, physical evidence, forensic findings, and statements from hundreds of witnesses. Organizing this material required discipline and careful attention to detail. The success of the investigation did not depend on one dramatic discovery alone. Instead, it depended on countless decisions made by many professionals working together. Detectives analyzed information and connected cases. Forensic specialists examined remains and evidence. Prosecutors prepared the legal strategy necessary to achieve convictions. Each contribution was essential. The case demonstrated that criminal investigations are often built through persistence rather than immediate answers. It also showed the importance of maintaining professional standards even in the most disturbing circumstances. The evidence recovered from the Charlotte Street residence was extremely significant, but its value depended on proper handling, documentation, and analysis. The investigation became a model of how documentary evidence can support physical evidence and witness testimony. The journals and photographs provided information that allowed investigators to reconstruct events, identify victims, and strengthen the prosecution's case. However, their importance extended beyond this specific investigation. The case reinforced a broader lesson in criminal justice. Evidence must always be examined objectively and responsibly. The goal of an investigation is not simply to prove suspicion, but to establish facts that can withstand legal examination. Another lasting impact of the Berdella case was the renewed awareness of the challenges surrounding missing persons investigations. The victims' disappearances were complicated by circumstances that made connections difficult to recognize at the time. The case highlighted the danger of assuming that some missing individuals are less likely to receive attention because of their background or personal circumstances. Every missing person represents someone whose life matters. Every disappearance deserves careful investigation. This principle has influenced ongoing discussions about improving communication between law enforcement agencies and ensuring that vulnerable populations receive appropriate attention. The lessons from cases like Berdella's continue to shape how investigators think about patterns, information sharing, and the importance of taking every missing person report seriously. However, perhaps the greatest lesson from the case is the importance of remembering victims rather than focusing only on offenders. True crime stories often become centered around the individuals who commit crimes because their actions are shocking and unusual. Yet this focus can unintentionally reduce victims to background details. A more responsible approach recognizes that victims existed long before the crimes committed against them. They had relationships, experiences, and identities separate from the tragedy that ended their lives. Remembering their names is an essential part of understanding the human cost behind any criminal investigation. The story of Robert Berdella is ultimately not only about what happened inside a house in Kansas City. It is about the people affected by those events and the efforts made afterward to uncover the truth. It is about families who refused to stop searching for answers. It is about investigators who continued working through overwhelming evidence. It is about forensic specialists who used science to restore identities. It is about a survivor who found the strength to escape and seek help. These elements define the true meaning of the case far more than the actions of the offender. Decades later, the investigation remains a reminder of the responsibility shared by communities and justice systems. Crimes may be hidden, evidence may be difficult to find, and answers may take years to uncover. But persistence can bring truth to light. The case demonstrates that justice is not only about punishment. It is also about recognition, remembrance, and restoring dignity to those whose voices have been taken away. Robert Berdella's name remains connected to one of the darkest criminal investigations in Missouri history. But the final chapter belongs to the victims and the people who worked to uncover their stories. Their lives, their families, and their memories are the reason the investigation continues to matter. The enduring message of the case is simple but powerful. Behind every criminal file is a human story, and every victim deserves to be remembered.